And Sadhu, thank you very much for the Canadian Consulate for hosting us here. I understand you're offering free Canadian citizenship to anybody that's interested. And I am meeting someone new today who is Yuping Chen, Senior Program Officer at the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. They don't do short titles at the UN. And we are going to talk a little bit about your role and about the United Nations interests in this theme here, improving digital spaces, which goes in a lot of different directions. And I want to just start maybe kind of going back to the beginning. David kind of painted a picture of the world we're in. You think about what the United Nations just down the block was founded to do, to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, promote social progress. We're at quite a moment, right? Soaring inequality and inflation, food crises, climate change, a security crisis in the world that is perhaps one of the most grave we've faced in decades. Real problems. How do you think about the role of the United Nations with regard to technology in the context of that initial mission and in the context of these grave crises?
Thank you so much, Justin, and thank you, David, for inviting me in the United Nations to be here today. I'll start off by saying a lot of what I say is in non-official, and some of my reflections be a little bit more personal as to what the UN is doing on digital. So I'll make a distinction between the official position and what I personally think at some points. I'll start off with the origin story. I think some of you will know that the UN's engagement on digital has not been that long-standing, and really has been in the recent years that there's been a real push on addressing digital challenges, digital cooperation at the United Nations. So apparently it started when the Secretary General had dinner with Henry Kissinger. This was right after he published the Peace and Foreign Policy about how artificial intelligence was going to be the next big thing in global challenges. And so based on that, Secretary General realized that really digital is going to be the next phase of a lot of the global challenges that the world is facing. So it was after that that he convened the high-level panel on digital cooperation. One of my colleagues, Anusha, actually was on the secretary of the high-level panel that was comprising dignitaries such as Jack Ma and Melinda Gates and other key luminaries in the area of technology to really explore how the international community could better come together to address digital challenges. Now, this was only in the last, I believe, 4 or 5 years. So it took the UN some time to catch up to what the rest of the world, and all of you probably knew way before the UN, that digital and technology, the online space, was really going to be as important as it is today. But at least the UN got that. So give us some credit for that. It took us a while, but now we're really engaging with digital challenges. Based on the high-level panel on digital cooperation, which issued a major report in 2019, the Secretary General then convened a number of multi-stakeholder roundtables. Now, the big word here, the UN, this basically means not just governments, but also civil society, private sector, academics, technical community to come together to address what it means for the UN and the international community to come together better to address digital challenges. And then the Secretary General issued another report. I understand this is part of the processes of the UN. It takes us a while to get there, where in the roadmap for digital cooperation, we actually lay out very specific recommendations. This is coming to the meat of it, on areas such as achieving universal global connectivity, digital human rights, digital inclusion, digital capacity building. And this is where, for the first time, the UN lays out a vision for how we collectively can achieve a more open, free, and secure digital future for all. And based on that roadmap for digital cooperation, there has been increased activity at the UN working with a lot of multi-stakeholder partners. And I think some perhaps of the entities in the room to take forward these specific recommendations in these areas to address precisely some of the global challenges that Justin had mentioned, and also that some of you actually are working directly on. Like I said, it's taken us a while to get there, but I think the UN now has realized that in order to address peace and security, environmental issues, climate change, human rights, and so forth, the digital aspect has to be part of how we work in this particular space. This other issue of how we as the UN need to address it is also more complicated because the UN, as you know, is founded as a member state-based organization. Even the concept of working with non-governments is something that's a little bit foreign and not bred into the UN's DNA. So this is part of the reason why it's taken us a while to get there, even today in the Office of the Tech Envoy. And we can talk a little bit about this. This challenge of creating digital spaces in a way that's multi-stakeholder remains a challenge. And this is something I think that collectively the international community has to work on. So I'm happy to elaborate a little bit further on that and tease out some of these aspects and what the ambitions are of the UN in this particular space. So just to sort of recap to say, We are working on it. The Secretary General has really repeatedly stressed that one of the priorities for the international community is to address how we need to better look at online challenges in all their various areas that you've mentioned, the ones that are laid out by the Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. And that's the foundation for what now he calls for in his Global Digital Compact proposal.
So I do just push you on this because, even in the first panel in the discussion today, we've been talking about competing values, right? And the fact that even in this country, certainly we don't have a shared set of values often when it comes to digital spaces, free expression. And when you take that to the international sort of context, of course, there is no agreement on what open an internet should look like, what free should be. How do you manage that in the United Nations? Is it possible to do in a context where, you've got quite a few member states that have a very different idea about what open might mean?
So that's the challenge, right? And I think this goes to perhaps the question of why it's taken the UN so long to get there. Even what we do now, I'm sure some of you would think that it's really more talk than actual action, because I'm very well aware of what people think of the UN. But what we do offer is a space to actually have these types of conversation, precisely among countries that disagree, and hopefully to also provide that space where stakeholders can come together and put forward those views on what these disagreements should be, but what we fundamentally should collectively agree on in terms of principles. And because the UN has had this long track record of standing for certain types of human rights principles, basic normative elements in how we think our future should look like, we think we have the convening power and the credibility to say, we all come to this table. We try to agree on values that are incumbent in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then think about what this means manifested in the digital space. The extent to which we then have the power to compel governments or the private sector, civil society, to do these things is another question. But at least we have the convening power and the universal legitimacy to at least bring people to that table. I would also say this is why I think I mentioned the Global Digital Compact that the Secretary General has proposed. This is what he foresees as that potential opportunity to bring everyone to the table to agree on common principles for open, free, and secure digital future for all. This is explicitly set out in a report that he issued last September called Our Common Agenda. Our Common Agenda is basically the Secretary General's manifesto or vision for what the future of multilateralism, key global challenges will be. So it's much more broad-ranging than just digital, online, and so forth. But one key aspect of that is that call for a global digital compact that will be, for the first time in the UN's history, not just for member states, but also for tech companies, private sector, and civil society as well.
So I do want to spend a little bit of time. Maybe we'll go through a couple of the pieces of the compact, in particular around, how you think about artificial intelligence, how you're thinking about connectivity, maybe the basics, digital inclusion. But I also just want to put to you, there are some countries that aren't waiting, right, for the Global Digital Compact. You've seen the United States lead an effort recently to create this declaration for the future of the internet that brought together 60 plus, mostly, I suppose all democracies, to issue a set of principles, a couple of pages worth of principles that they could agree to. How do efforts like that kind of fit alongside things like the Global Digital Compact, which may seek to bring in voices that are not democratic?
So that's an interesting question, and perhaps you should direct it to the Americans to see how they think it should fit in with the UN's efforts. I would actually say that the messaging from the UN has been not just to the Americans, but to perhaps any other consortium or member states or global initiative, that the best way to get agreement and universal consensus and to universalize the principles that you believe in is to take them to a universal forum like the United Nations. And that if we really are to create an open, free, and secure internet based on principles, the more opportunity there is to discuss and persuade others to agree on those principles is your best shot as creating a global, open, free, secure internet. I mean, an open and free internet is not necessarily something that is just for some countries. And if you're having a conversation among those that already agree, then you risk leaving out those that you would need to persuade further, or those individuals in other countries who might aspire to what you also believe in, but need a little bit more help to get there. So I think it is really for all groups of like-minded countries or countries that believe in certain types of values to really see the UN as an opportunity to universalize those values. I think, if I'm not wrong, the Declaration on the Future of the Internet the Americans issued, there is a reference to contributing to other processes, including at the United Nations. So we do think that the Global Digital Compact that the Secretary General has actually proposed is an opportunity precisely to bring these values, which, to be very frank, we don't disagree with. And in fact, the principles are actually exactly in line with what the Secretary General has called for: human rights respecting, open, free, and secure, human-centered development, meaningful access, universal connectivity. But so then that discussion, I think, really needs to be universalized. One other point I would say that I think it is also important to think about the multi-stakeholder aspect of a lot of these digital issues. So I think the Americans were working on starting with governments, but there has been that feeling from some of the multi-stakeholders that we've engaged with that it has to also be broader than that and go beyond just the governments as well. So for instance, in the Global Digital Compact, the Secretary General's proposal was for a multi-stakeholder track. The Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology that I work in has recently opened a public space to get public inputs from everybody as to the content of this compact. And here we've been very clear that it's not just about governments, but we want to hear from individuals, civil society, tech companies, private sector, any entity that really wants to contribute to this thinking around what a digital future should look like and really put forward some ideas along those lines. So it is not, as I've said before, baked into the DNA of multilateral processes, much less the UN, to work in this fashion. And it has been quite a challenge, frankly, at the UN to do this, even from my office itself, but we're at least committed to trying that.
Is there, lest I come off as being, promoting the declaration over the global compact, there's certainly, I was at a meeting yesterday in Washington, D.C. around countering digital hate. And there was a sense in the room, certainly from some of the officials from other countries, that, of course, the U.S.'s laissez-faire attitude towards its own tech firms in Silicon Valley has created, some of the conditions that we're all here to talk about trying to alleviate. So perhaps we're more part of the problem than part of the solution. Is there a view like that in the United Nations about what the United States needs to do in order to get its house in order?
So I think if there is such a view at the UN, I say neither that there is or there isn't, then it's precisely because you have or may not have this view that you should take it to the UN so that other countries that may or may not have this view have an opportunity to opine on what the United States should be doing about that particular situation. So again, I think I come back down to this message, right? Like, if you want to win a global discussion about global values for the global internet, then it's probably best to have these discussions in a global forum, precisely to address these views that may or may not be present at the UN.
So I want to talk about the compact maybe, and I don't, it's not maybe right to think of it this way, but across its range of areas of interest, it goes from things like connectivity, so the most basic, can we get people connected to the internet, whether that's a good thing or not, on through to artificial intelligence and emerging technologies and looking out to the future. Where do you think the UN's focus should be at the moment? We've got huge numbers of people who still are not connected to the global internet or do not have access to what we would think of in this room as the internet. What do you kind of put the emphasis on across all of those various sets of concerns? So the roadmap for digital cooperation on compact is supposed to be all-encompassing precisely because we have all these aspects. But the UN is particularly concerned with precisely what you said, this lack of digital access and meaningful universal connectivity. It's 2.9 billion people that are still unconnected. This means they don't have access to the transformative benefits of technology. They can't even get to that discussion about AI when you don't even have regular internet access with which to communicate with people. The experience of COVID, for instance, has shown how basic internet connectivity in a meaningful fashion is really essential to just getting basic information, to schooling, to working online. And so when you think of the fact that 2.9 billion people are still unconnected, the majority of which are women, the majority of which are in developing countries, it becomes really, as the Secretary General has commented on, the new face of inequality, the digital haves and the digital have-nots. For instance, the latest statistics say that only 1 in 4 individuals in the least developed countries in the world have access to internet. The cost of internet is practically unaffordable in a lot of these countries as well. So really, again, it accentuates existing social economic divides between rural and urban, between women and men, where the global gender gap in usage of internet, for instance, is something like 15% in a lot of countries. So if you do not want to heap on existing inequalities and you really want to use the opportunity to recover from COVID in a manner that is more inclusive,
more robust and more resilient, you really have to look at digital dimension. And so the United Nations has indeed put priority on this aspect of digital inclusion, digital capacity building, achieving universal meaningful connectivity. So you'll see a lot of the activity around the UN built along those areas. And then not that it is separate, the questions around digital security, around artificial intelligence can be part of how we bring people online, because you want to bring people online in a manner that's safe, inclusive, and empowering as well. So in the process of bringing people internet connectivity, we have to do so in a rights respecting fashion, in a manner with infrastructure that is open and free and also protects their rights. So we don't necessarily see it as separate, but we do definitely think that there has to be a focus on what it means to address the digital divide globally.
So in the digital compact's announcement or the materials available, you do talk about the idea of establishing accountability criteria for discrimination and misleading content. Now, assuming those criteria aren't set yet, can you explain how the United Nations would put together such criteria? Who gets involved in that type of discussion?
So this is actually one of the areas where it was proposed as an area for the Global Digital Compact, but we actually don't really have a specific framework in mind. I get asked this a lot, is there already a secret compact being drafted? It isn't really. It's a bit of a blank slate right now. And that's why we've opened up this public inclusive process to hear from what everybody thinks needs to be part of the digital compact. We also are quite realistic in our expectations, right? We're not expecting this compact to be the be all and end all in terms of establishing its criteria. We think it could be, again, the opportunity to set basic top line principles for how we want to approach these issues. There are also more specific follow-ups when it comes to the area of disinformation, misinformation that are being carried out pursuant to the Common Agenda in other areas. So for instance, if you read the Common Agenda report, there's also a proposal for a code of conduct for integrity in public information, where we think it will also deal with these types of issues. So again, not to say that this is the solution, and this is where I think we turn to multi-stakeholder community, organizations like yourself, people and experts that have actually worked in this space to advise the UN on what you think should be done, seeing the digital compact as not necessarily the solution, but the chance to open up those discussions, possibly for further thinking processes or institutions around those lines.
So I don't know, we'll probably finish up here in just a second. I'll ask one last question, which is really to just connect to this work. I know at Tech Policy Press, the reason I care so much about tech policies, I see it as a factor in all of the great challenges that we face, including climate change. And the UN is perhaps most active on global crises with regard to climate change. How do you connect your role in working on tech issues to the problem of climate change?
So it's interesting you raised that one, because if you look at the 7 areas that I mentioned in the Common Agenda for the Digital Compact, one area that isn't mentioned is precisely this area of environment. And we've taken some criticism for it. And my response has been, that's why the stakeholder community has to get engaged to say that this is an important aspect that has not been factored enough into the discussions around digital. There is, in fact, what we call the Coalition on Digital Environmental Sustainability that my office works on with the United Nations Environment Program, the United Nations Development Program, the governments of Germany, Kenya, the International Science Council, Future of Life. That is launching in a number of days at the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, another UN conference, precisely this coalition to bring these nexus of digital environmental sustainability together to say that there needs to be a plan for how we address digital given the impact of environmental issues, climate change, and so forth. So if you're interested in this area, I encourage you to look into how you can be part of that. They actually have a very vibrant multi-stakeholder community. They've had a process of co-creating a plan of action that will precisely call for action in these areas and really talk about how we need to better inform the discussions around climate and environment by the digital technology aspect as well. Oh, I also want to end on one very quick point. At the end of the day, the Global Digital Compact is not for me as part of the UN Secretariat to determine. It's going to be up to the member states. And this is why I think it is very important that all of us that are concerned about these issues put pressure on the people who feel that they have the most power in this particular negotiation, which is the governments, to make sure that they stand for those right types of values. What we are doing at the UN now in the Office of the Tech Envoy is to create the space precisely for multi-stakeholder engagement and to put the pressure on to make sure that the governments realize where the future of the digital space should rest and to engage with stakeholders. But it is important to also make sure that governments hear that message, that it's no longer just governments that should be at the table or discussing it, but it should also be private sector companies, civil society speaking out, other actors, youth activists, technical community, and so forth that have to be part of that discussion as well.
So maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations, promoting social progress. Perhaps that's all of our job. And certainly talking about it is better than the alternative. And we'll continue to do that here and hopefully in the United Nations as well. Yu Ping Chen, thank you. And David, thank you.